Hello everybody, my name is Julia Farley and I'm the curator of the British and European Iron Age collections at the British Museum. You'll see me here in my kind of home office setup where I'm working at the moment because of course these are very strange times and we're not able to get into the museum. So first and foremost, I just wanted to send our well wishes and my well wishes to you, to your family and friends and all of your loved ones. I hope everybody is safe and well. Because none of us are able to get into the museum, we wanted to do something really special for you, our members. And so last week you will have had an email from our lovely membership team. And they asked you if you had any questions that you would like to ask the museum or ask me about the Iron Age, about ancient Britain. And you've really delivered. Thank you so much. I'm always really impressed by the really interesting and insightful questions that our members ask, and this is no different. And so what I'm going to do now is go through and answer those questions. I'm going to answer every question that was sent in. I have 5 questions and they provide quite a nice little sort of introduction to Iron Age Britain together. So we're going to talk about time frame, the chronology, when is the Iron Age. We're going to talk about the peoples who lived in Iron Age Britain, what was their name, maybe what did they call themselves. We're going to talk about the language or languages that they spoke, about the kind of trade that they were carrying out, and finally, towards the end of the Iron Age, how Romanised were they, and how much contact with the Roman world did they have. So that's what I'm going to be going through with you, and I will start without further ado with our first question. So this is from Barnea Levi Sullivan, and Barnea says, as a Levantine archaeologist, I constantly grapple with fitting British dating definitions in the broader scheme of things. Please could you briefly address the dating and the reason behind it? And this is an incredibly sensible question. The Iron Age sounds like something that should have one particular definite beginning and end date and that everybody would agree on. It isn't and it doesn't. The Iron Age is part of the 3-age system that we use when we're talking about deeper history and people who maybe didn't leave written records behind to enable us to know what they might have called themselves. So we talk about them, grouping them chronologically by the most advanced kind of technology that they are using. So starting with the Stone Age, then Bronze Age societies, and finally Iron Age. And because it's based on the kind of technology that people have, Iron Age is a relative term, and it doesn't happen at the same time everywhere, and it doesn't happen everywhere at all. If you live somewhere like North America, which doesn't have the same kind of ancient use of iron, you don't get an Iron Age. And so when we talk about the Iron Age, as Barnea very sensibly points out, if I'm talking about the British Iron Age, I'm not necessarily going to be using the same chronology as in the Levant. So what chronology am I using? Well, in Western Europe, we tend to say that the Iron Age begins around 800 BC. And that is when iron first comes into widespread use. So it's not necessarily the very, very first pieces of iron that are found, but it's iron working technology being widespread and iron being something which we find on quite a few sites. It gets off to quite a slow start. Iron is a great step forward from bronze in terms of its practical use. So for things like swords and axes, where you really need sharp metal that is going to keep that sharp edge for a long time, iron is much better than bronze at doing that. But nevertheless, for at least about 200 years in Western Europe, so from about 800 BC to about 600 BC, a lot of swords and axes are still being made in bronze. You know, that tradition dies really, really hard, and it takes a very long time to make that shift. So a lot of the changes that we really tend to associate with the Iron Age in Western Europe, so the developing of kind of full-blown ironworking technology, people being able to move into different kinds of agricultural land because they have more effective ploughs, so they can plough kind of clayey soil, people living perhaps in larger, denser settlements, even the beginnings of urbanism, and that happens earlier in other places, but in Western Europe we're really looking at about sort of 600 to 400 BC with a lot of those changes. So the Iron Age gets off to quite a slow start in terms of how quickly that technology spreads. And just like the beginning of the Iron Age, the end of the Iron Age is also relative and depends on where you are. And so today I'm talking about Britain, and in Britain we say that the Iron Age ends in AD 43 with Claudius's invasion, the Roman invasion of Britain. And this is sort of lifting the veil for you a little bit on why and how we use these chronological terms. Because of course the Romans are also an Iron Age society. There are some ways in which they're more technologically advanced than the Iron Age peoples of Britain, but they don't have any spectacular new material that puts them in a new age. But we're able to start using the terms Romans and Roman Britain from AD 43 because we have written text. And so we know what that society calls itself, and we're able to use this big kind of broad brush term. For the Iron Age, we don't have anything quite that straightforward. We don't know the name that Iron Age groups in Britain necessarily called themselves. And this leads us, hopefully quite nicely, to our second question, which is from Jill Dodge. How would you describe peoples living in Britain before the Roman invasion in AD 43? Were they Celts, ancient Britons, a mixture of peoples? How long had they been resident in Britain? And this is an excellent question, and it goes kind of to the heart of what I was just saying about, why we don't have another term for, the pre-Roman Iron Age in Britain. Because these people didn't leave behind much in the way of texts of their own, and we're going to get to that in language in the next question, so no spoilers just yet. But we don't know whether or not, we don't know what they called themselves, and we don't know for certain whether or not they had a name for all of themselves. I strongly suspect that they did not. So the kind of short answer to your question, Jill, is that I would prefer to use the term ancient Britons over Celts. When we are trying to give names to the people that we're studying who didn't leave behind their own records, we are limited to using what other people said about them quite often. And in the case of Iron Age Britain, that's Roman texts and earlier Greek texts as well. And when we do have classical texts that refer to the peoples of this island, they tend to refer to the Britanni or the Prytani with a P. And so for that reason, I would tend to prefer that word. Classical texts, so anything from the Iron Age time period, don't talk about the people living in Britain at that time as being Celts. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute after we talk about languages. But so I wouldn't use that term to talk about Britain because we don't have any evidence that people in Britain were using that word to describe themselves. Although classical texts do talk about Celts in other places, such as northern France. So there obviously are people living in Europe during the Iron Age who do use that word to describe themselves, but probably not in Britain. And so Jill also asks, how long had these people, these ancient Britons, that's what I'm going to call them, how long had they been resident in Britain, the people who lived here during the Iron Age? And this, again, is kind of a tricky one. And I'm going to circle back to this a bit when I talk about the Celts after we talk about languages. But if we take something we're maybe a bit more familiar in thinking about, the Roman invasion. After the Roman invasion, we call the people of Britain Roman Britons, or the Romano-British. And yet, most of the people who lived in Britain in AD 44 were exactly the same people as the people who lived in Britain in AD 42. And they might not really have necessarily changed a huge amount in how they thought of themselves either. And because we are studying archaeology kind of from a great distance chronologically, we're dealing with this really kind of zoomed out picture. So we want a name for a group of people who lived in that particular kind of place or that quite big region for a whole span of time. But it's often really difficult to actually do that because that isn't necessarily how people as individuals work. And you will know this, yourself. If you imagine you're on holiday somewhere and somebody asks you where you're from, the answer that you give will vary depending on who's asking, how much you think they might want to know, how much you think they might know about the country or the place where you're from. Are you going to give just the country? Are you going to give the city? Are you going to talk about your family and the really kind of nitty gritty little bit of that region that you actually come from? And it would have been the same in the Iron Age. So there is no nation of Britain in the Iron Age, and if somebody from Iron Age Britain had travelled somewhere else or had even travelled to the continent, they might say, that they'd crossed the sea or something like that, but they wouldn't have a sense that they came from a particular nation or a particular country. That's a much more modern idea of how societies work. And probably, if you'd asked them about who they are, they would have given an answer about their family. They might have said, oh yeah, I'm Jeff's son, he's the blacksmith in the next village over, maybe you know him. Or they might have talked perhaps about, their wider political allegiances. But again, that's not necessarily a kind of a territory that you could draw a line around on a map. It might be a particular leader that they follow, or a particular group of families that they, would kind of side with in a fight, or in a political disagreement. It's not necessarily a kind of physical territory or a physical place. So whenever we're trying to talk about a people and their name, and sort of where they came from, actually our sense for a lot of at the time of ancient Britain, pre-Roman Britain, is that of course people are moving around, people are moving back and forth from the continent and from further afield, but just like with the Roman invasion, when we see quite big social changes or technological changes, like the beginning of the Iron Age, we're not generally seeing a wholesale kind of population replacement. So most people are probably descendants of people who've lived here for quite a long time. And there might be some exceptions to that, and ADNA, so research on ancient DNA, looking at bones from archaeological excavations, going way back into deep time in Britain, are helping us to answer some more of those questions about population movement. And it may be that there are some times, such as the beginnings of farming and the beginning of the Bronze Age, when we do see a bigger shift in the actual kind of the population who's living here in Britain. But I don't think that the Iron Age is one of those times. Things like iron is more about ideas moving around. And we don't have a unified group. So although we can call them ancient Britons, and I think that's very sensible because we need to have some kind of a shorthand for talking about this, they themselves probably thought about themselves as a much more kind of like sort of fractured, smaller series of groups, and they were probably much more focused on the local scale. And that comes to our next question, which is from Peter Spurging, who's calling from Seattle, has sent in his question from Seattle in the USA. And he says, was there a common fundamental language throughout Iron Age Britain, with each tribe speaking a dialect that was a version of the underlying language? And Peter's got kind of two questions. And Peter, I'm going to kind of move up a little bit of your second question. Am I correct that there was no written language in Iron Age Britain? I understand some inscriptions appeared on coins in the year before the Roman invasion. And it will become apparent why I'm dealing with those together. So the short answer is that we don't know, because as you say, there's no kind of, detailed inscriptions left from the time in ancient Britain before the Roman conquest. So we don't know exactly what languages people spoke. But my guess would be that it's much more about a range of languages rather than a single unified language with different dialects. Partly for that very reason that we're talking about, that people, there is no nation of Britain, and people are living a much more kind of fragmented kind of small scale life, and there will be some kind of tribal groups that have a single leader. But even in other places, even that may be a level of kind of hierarchy beyond what there is. And from comparison with other times and places, it's most likely that they were speaking a range of languages. And it would have been much more common probably for an individual to speak 2, 3 or even more languages just in order to get by. It's quite unusual, the modern world that we live in, where whole great big areas, everyone speaks the same language and can all understand each other. And that wasn't necessarily the case in the past. So I think they spoke many different languages, and the coin inscriptions that you mentioned actually have a really nice example of this. So inscriptions on coins in Iron Age Britain do show some level of literacy there, and they are inspired by Roman coins, and we're going to come at the end of this to that kind of bigger question about connections with Rome, so I won't spoil that, but certainly we know that there is some speaking of Latin and some ability to read Latin in the people who are writing and making these inscriptions. So some of the coins use, for example, the word rex, Latin for king, and they might use abbreviations like F for filius, son of, so people actually using Latin terms to talk about their family dynasties and those ruling kind of dynasties, which is really interesting and exciting. And but the other thing, which in some ways is more intriguing, is that of course, if you're going to say Rex or Filius, you need your name. So these local rulers are also putting names of people and of places, perhaps where they're minting those coins, where they're ruling from, on these indigenous Iron Age coins from the kind of mid-1st century BC onwards. And linguists have been able to look at those names to try and understand what kind of languages they might have come from, because names, of course, like any other word, vary by the language that you speak. And something that I want to touch on here, and this is going to kind of circle back to the mention of the Celts, is the difference between languages and language families. So again, this is that sort of, whether you're looking at like a local level or whether you're zooming out and trying to look at the really big picture, which probably people didn't do in the Iron Age, but we want to do now. And so when we look at those coin names, those inscriptions, linguists suggest, and it's very plausible, that we're seeing two different language families in Britain. So probably lots and lots of different languages, but those languages falling into linguistic groups. And as an example of that, if you think about modern day languages, English and German, for example, both fall into the modern Germanic language family. So if you speak English, you can't necessarily speak or understand German. They're two different languages, and they're not mutually intelligible. But if you're a linguist and you study those languages, you can look at the grammar, you can look at the way that words are formed, and you can see relationships between those languages and say that they must therefore be part of the same family, even if that wouldn't necessarily be noticeable to the average person who is speaking them. And we see that as well, for example, in the modern world in the Romance languages, which have developed from Latin, so French, Italian, Spanish, Romanian, those kind of languages. And they will have quite clear relationships and differences in their vowel sounds, which are standard across the whole language, but they're still separate languages. And in ancient Britain, from those inscriptions, we think that we are seeing Germanic languages being spoken in Eastern England, and in the west of England, we're seeing members of the Celtic language family being spoken. And this is the first time that I've talked about Celtic in Britain. So because we're talking about languages, I'm going to just take a moment to go back to this question about the Celts. So what I've just said is confusing, because I've told you that there weren't ancient Celts living in Britain, but I've also told you that they might have been speaking what today we call Celtic languages. What's up with that? Why am I making it so complicated? And this comes down to the study of the past and the study of those language families. The people who originally spoke those languages in ancient Britain wouldn't necessarily even have realised that some languages are more closely related than others. It's not something that stands out to you unless you are studying languages as a linguist, and this is our kind of zoomed out modern perspective. So they probably didn't even have a name for these groupings of languages. And but what we can see now from our perspective is that the languages which are spoken today, the living Celtic languages, Welsh, Scots and Irish Gaelic, and of course, Cornish and Breton and Manx and all these other languages, they all are part of the same language family, and that language family certainly does seem to have pre-Roman origins, and particularly was spoken possibly in much of Western Europe, and certainly in those areas of Britain for a very, very long time. And it wouldn't have had a name, but scholars who were studying those languages in the early 1700s decided to give that language family the name Celtic. And this is because this is the time when people are starting to develop these kind of larger sort of national identities and wanting to tell stories about their nation, which go beyond just tracing themselves back to the Bible or Greek myths like the Trojan War and the Odyssey and things like that. So they want to tell those stories, and in order to get hold of those stories, they start looking at classical texts, which at the same time, we're talking here about the kind of 15th century onwards, are becoming much more widely available because of things like the printing press, new translations, and people come across the word Celts that writers from the Greek and Roman world were using. And they borrow that word and they apply it to pretty much anything pre-Roman from Europe. So in the absence of having more words and having a kind of finer grained understanding of it, that word Celtic gets applied to initially the languages which do have these pre-Roman origins of much of Western Europe, and then gradually from that word gets borrowed further and starts to be applied to the distinctive art styles and the special kind of histories and traditions that we see in what today we therefore call the Celtic nations. And those histories are completely real, but the use of the word Celts or Celtic to describe those identities and those stories only dates back to around about the 1700s or so. So that's hopefully something to go to Jill's question and Peter's question about who these people are and about the languages that they speak. And I'm now going to move on firstly to the second half of Peter's question, which is about maritime trade. So thinking about those coins and how they're copying Roman coins and that kind of connection there, Peter asked, presumably these coins are based on examples brought over from mainland Europe as part of the maritime trade. Are there any artefacts remaining that are related to this trade? I'm thinking of tally sticks or similar records. So unfortunately we don't have any records like that of this kind of trade. We don't have those kind of written records from Iron Age Britain. But we do have some kind of general accounts of the sort of trade that is happening. So Strabo, for example, writing in the 1st century BC, talks about exports out of Britain of grain, cattle, gold, silver, iron, animal hides, slaves and hunting dogs. And hunting dogs in particular, dogs suited for the chase is the term that Strabo uses. And these are especially trained in Britain and kind of really renowned for the quality of our hunting dogs. But all of those things I'm talking about, kind of like grain and, iron, those are your sort of basic staples which are going from Britain to the Roman world. And coming in exchange, in another text he mentions ivory chains and necklaces, amber gems, glass vessels. So we're trading basics for Roman luxuries, and I think that is that's quite telling. And then we're going to come to that in the final question about how Romanised these people are. We also have some archaeological evidence for the nature of that trade. So we have, for example, lots of amphorae, vessels, those kind of like tall, long vessels with handles on either side, which we find in Britain. They're made in the Roman world. They're filled with wine and imported over. So people they're choosing what they import from the Roman world, and they really like that delicious Northern Italian wine. Can't really blame them. And Roman kind of fine wares and table vessels and silver cups. And some of these might be diplomatic gifts from the Roman world, and others might be things that are just coming through as trade. There are also a few little bits of archaeological evidence for things that we might be exporting from Britain, and so things that we're kind of known for having. One thing that gets reported in texts is the Birrus Britannicus, which is a special kind of duffel coat, basically, which we're very much known for in Britain. It's very high quality, and that is one of our exports out as well. So even 2,000 years before Paddington Bear, Britain, known for the nice woolen duffel coat, and we read about it in text, and we also have these lovely carvings which have people wearing their little kind of hoods up in these long coats. So there's particular things like that, and just a handful of particular kind of objects that normally are only really found in Britain. Examples are beautiful polished bronze mirror plates, or a particular kind of brooch which we call the dragonesque brooch, which is a little S-shaped beast with a little dragon head at both ends, and that's a brooch that you would wear in kind of early Roman Britain, which combines elements of like indigenous design and style with Roman ideas of dress and Roman technology for making and enamelling those brooches. And in both of those cases, so both the mirrors and the dragonesque brooches, which are both being made in Britain in the first centuries BC and AD, we do occasionally find finds of those on the continent. So those are almost certainly objects which have been traded out of Britain. And in the case of the dragonesque brooches in particular, rather than it being a kind of bustling trade, it might be that they're actually moving with members of the Roman army and their families, but they've picked up this kind of almost souvenir of their time in Britain. So we do have things moving back and forth. In terms of your question, Peter, about like actual records, the best I can really do for that, because in the absence of real records, is to go back a bit earlier to the late Bronze Age, and there is a shipwreck, the Salcombe shipwreck, from off the Devon coast, which is where a ship that was either coming into Britain or just leaving Britain has sunk, and so we actually have its kind of inventory. And this is much, much earlier than that Roman stuff I've been talking about. So it's more like sort of 1200 to 900 BC. But it is evidence that this kind of, long distance maritime trade doesn't just start with the Romans. It's been happening for a long time. And this ship, even though it must be, either just kind of coming or going, but its cargo includes things from Britain, but also from across the continent, even one object from as far afield as Sicily. You've got things like, copper ingots, tin ingots, a sword, items of gold jewellery. So there is this bustling trade back and forth across the Channel, going back hundreds and even thousands of years in the Iron Age. So the final question, which I'm going to address, comes from Richard Offer, and I know a Richard Offer, so if that's you, then hello, Richard. And it touches on this idea about trade that we've been talking about, and that question is, how Romanised were the late Iron Age tribes? I understand from recent excavations they had assimilated many of the advantages and luxuries of Roman life. And so from what I've been talking about with trade, that will become quite evident that that's really true. And here I want to kind of fuzzify, if you like, that kind of end of the Iron Age date that I've talked about at the beginning even more. So we talk about the Roman conquest of AD 43, and that's right, and that's when Britain officially becomes a province. But if we go back about 100 years before that, Caesar, who's one of these people writing about the Celts over in France, he comes over and makes expeditions into Britain in 55 and 54 BC. And by his own account, Caesar basically conquers the Iron Age tribes and subdues the Iron Age tribes of Britain. In reality, we don't think he got much further than Kent. This is one of the things about this very kind of fractured world of lots of different tribes and competing groups and general kind of fluidity in your sort of political arrangements, that it's very difficult to conquer the entire island because there is not one single group who lives there. But Caesar does nonetheless make these kind of arrangements, and he probably will have taken back to Rome with him So he goes back to Gaul after that, finishes up his war in Gaul, brings France properly into the Roman Empire, and goes back to Rome. And probably with him he will have taken what in Latin are called obsides, which is often translated as hostages, though that's maybe a little bit misleading. And these will be the sons and daughters, the heirs really, of those leaders in southern Britain and surely places in France and other places that he has conquered. And the reason why it's a little bit misleading to call these people hostages is because partly they are there to make sure their parents toe the line and pay their taxes, and there absolutely is that sort of threat. But also, these are people who are being well looked after and they're being brought up in Rome, or certainly in the Roman world, to have Roman tastes, with the idea that when they are old enough, they will go back and take over from their parents as, client rulers in their own parts of the world. And if you want to get, buy-in from these people who are ruling at the edges of your empire, that's a really good way to do it. Because if you bring these people up to have Roman tastes, then that is absolutely what they're going to have and what they're going to want. And so Richard is really right that we do see well before AD 43, people starting to live in southern Britain in particular in a much more Roman style. And this is probably partly because some of those rulers who are returning maybe 10, 15, 20 years after Caesar's invasions, so maybe in the sort of mid-30s BC, these might be people who've actually grown up in Rome and they have Roman tastes. So is it any surprise that we see a big uptick in trade? We see people changing how they live, how they build their buildings. So rather than these kind of small organic villages of circular round houses made of kind of, wattle and daub and thatch, we start to see things that look a little bit more like we might expect a town to look. We see grid layouts in the street in some areas. We start seeing rectilinear buildings even. And this is probably due to that increasing connection with Rome, not least because in southern Britain at least, so in the southeast and down in Kent and the areas just north and south of the Thames, we're probably seeing client rulers their power is underwritten by Rome. They may themselves even have grown up in Rome, and these are the people who are minting all of those coins, which have things describing them as King Rex, or talking about their dynasties and giving their names in Latin inscriptions. So we really are seeing this big change. And Britain is very varied, it's very regional, and that stays the same throughout. So changes in northern Britain, which has its own, political complexities and things, they don't have quite such close contact with the Roman world. But I wanted to leave you with something from up further north, which I think shows that they do gradually get kind of drawn into it, and shows a little bit how these changes happen. And that's the South Cave Hoard, which is a group of weapons, swords and spears, which is buried in South Cave in Yorkshire, probably around about AD 70s. And this is, the Roman conquest kind of moves quite slowly up north. It's right at the time of the Roman conquest in that region. And these swords look kind of really quite, indigenous in style. They have this Iron Age, what today we call Celtic, art designs, swirling lines and beasts, and creatures. And they obviously are a symbol of local kind of, martial, like military power and power in fighting and in war. But they are buried, taken out of circulation in the ground by whoever owned them at this time around the Roman conquest. And the hoard pit is packed out with pottery shards. And those pottery shards are from amphorae. And so you might think, oh yeah, wine, everyone loves wine. I've been importing that for a while. But these aren't wine amphorae. They're actually olive oil amphorae. And so the, whoever these people are who have these very indigenous looking weapons, even the weapons themselves show connections to a wider world. So there's one sword which has bits of elephant ivory incorporated into it, which is, of course, that's a trade good coming up somehow through the Mediterranean and the Roman world. And they also have a taste for olive oil, which isn't something that you're going to drink. It's something which obviously is used in food preparation and cooking. So these connections are spreading beyond the south, and sometimes in quite interesting and unexpected ways. And I think that speaks a little bit to the complexity of this question about who we are and how these people saw themselves even at that time. So with that little story about that hoard, I will leave you. Thank you so much for sticking with me and for listening to all of this. And again, I hope that you and your families are safe and well, and all your loved ones. And we just really wanted to thank you so much for supporting the museum through this really difficult time. And I wanted to say that we're looking forward to welcoming you all back to the museum when we can all get together again. So I hope to see you very soon. Take care for now. Bye.